I did several, in fact, for them. And then we went to Brands Hatch with the John Coombs GTO. And here we are, chasing Lorenzo Bandini, who was a works Formula One Ferrari driver, and he is driving the 330 LMB 4-litre. Looks like a GTO, but it isn't. It's got a 330 LMB. He was driving the car that Michael Salmon and I took to 5th place at Le Mans in '63. And I'm just about to pass him here. I'm in the Coombs car. We're going into South Bend, and I overtake him. I finished 5th overall in first GT. He finished 8th. So I was actually quite happy about that because he was quite a serious driver. The same car that you see Bandini driving there, here's Michael Salmon and myself in car 12, and there were 3 of these in the race, 1 North American racing team, 1 Ferrari France, and 1 Maranello Concessionaires, which is our car. The other 2 didn't finish, but we finished 5th. So that's the old Le Mans. Not too much spectator protection if you look at it. Odd straw bale. But that's how it was in those days. Now we have 1964 Le Mans was notable for the fact that I was invited to drive the AC Cobra Coupe. It had nothing to do with the Shelby Cobra Daytonas. It was made by AC Cars. It was called the AC Cobra Coupe, and it became, here it is, a lovely looking car. It became infamous for achieving 185 miles an hour on the M1. And Peter Bolton, I'll just point out the characters here. That's Derek Hurlock, who was the chairman, managing director, and owner of AC Cars. That's me. That's the late Peter Bolton, who's only very recently died. He was my co-driver. And this is Tony Martin, who worked in Fleet Street on the administration side of one of the big national newspapers, and was the nephew of Derek Hurlock. So here we all are at Le Mans, and that's the lorry that the car came from England in. A little bit different to the big transporters that you see today. Anyhow, tell you about the 185 miles an hour in the M1. The car was tested in sort of May '63, and we went to Myra, the testing track that the manufacturers use. We could only wind it up to 165, so we thought, well, there must be more to come. And the idea came a fortnight before Le Mans, early June. Let's go to the M1, meet at 4 o'clock in the morning, and see what it'll do down the M1. Now, it might sound outrageous, but all the manufacturers were using the M1 to try their cars out. I mean, Aston Martins were coming out of Newport Pagnell straight onto the M1. Coventry, Jaguar coming out. Brighton on Dunsmore, the Roots Group were coming out with their cars. All going like hell early in the morning, seeing how fast they'd go. Nobody said a word. There was no speed limit, no problem. But at any rate, we went down to this service station. It was the southern end of the M1. 4 o'clock in the morning, got the car out, and I went down several miles. There was virtually no traffic at all. And after I'd got maximum revs, brake, went over a bridge, back down the other side, over a bridge, and back into the service station. So the boffins, remember there was no calculators in those days, so the boffins had slide rules. And they knew what the differential Darwin opinion ratio was. They knew the tire size, the wheel size, and all that jazz. What they didn't know was how many revs I'd done, so I told them. And the slide rule went backwards and forwards, and one of them looked up and said, well, you were doing 185. So how did it feel? So I said, it felt really, really good. So Peter Bolton got in it, and he tooled up the road and down, and he was happy. So we packed the whole thing up, and I suppose it was just under 2-hour journey back to my home in Norfolk. I was back home for 8 o'clock bacon and egg breakfast, which my late wife Cicely cooked for me. And everything was calm and everybody was happy. This guy, Tony Martin on the right, working in Fleet Street, at lunchtime, all these people, he worked on the administration side of a national newspaper, not as a journalist. But they all peel off and go into the wine bars in Fleet Street, and Elvino's being one of the most popular. And he sort of casually turned around to one of his friends and said, oh, I've just seen my uncle's car do 185 miles an hour on the M1. Well, of course, this journalist, the bomb was falling, and it hit the ground with a hell of a bang, and of course the whole story went down Fleet Street. It was the silly season, there was nobody else to write about, so they made a real big story of this 185 miles an hour on the M1, and all sorts of things happened, not the least of which we were hounded all the time we were at Le Mans. The race was not very good. Unfortunately, Peter Bolton had a tyre blowout. The car was wrecked, and it didn't finish. But he and I were always blamed for the speed limit, the 70 mile an hour speed limit. And I've had to live with this for a hell of a long time. But the truth came out at the end of the day. This guy, Tony Martin on the right, met Barbara Castle, who was by now Baroness Castle, who, if you remember at the time, 1963, was actually, she was a non-driver. She was Minister of Transport, but she didn't drive a car. So it was a great appointment, wasn't it? You know, you can imagine how well she understood the traffic problems. So anyhow, Tony Martin went up to her and said, oh, Lady Castle, I'm really pleased to meet you and talk to you tonight. I do want to just talk to you about the Cobra that went up the M1 at 185 miles an hour. Do you remember this? Oh, yes, she said, I certainly do. Didn't it create a furore? So he said, well, I'm terribly anxious to know, did that escapade make you put the 70 limit on the motorways and on the road system? And she said, no, not at all. She said, we had thought about it. We didn't do it for 2 or 3 years after that escapade. So suddenly, I was relieved of this terrible responsibility. And if anybody comes up and says, well, of course, you were responsible for the M1 problem, for the 70 limit, I can tell them the truth. So there it is. Now, what's the time here? We're still all right. Now we move to the Wilment Cobra Roadster. And there's a story to tell here. This is the very first Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, 1964. And there was a GT support race on that day, and I was to drive the Wilment Cobra Roadster, which I was looking forward to very much. It wasn't a very good practice for me. I didn't do very well, and I finished second place on the second row of the grid in 4th fastest time. I should have been pole. My teammate Bob Olthoff was pole position, but he crashed just after he'd done it. And the car couldn't be repaired for the next day. So pole position was empty. And on the warming up lap on race day, I thought, that's a bit of luck. I'm on the inside of the second row, 4th fastest. There'll be a blank space in front of me where Olthoff should be, but I knew wouldn't be. In the middle was Jackie Stewart in the Coombs lightweight E-type. And on the outside of the front row was Roy Salvadori in the Tommy Atkins Cobra.